welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab and continuing with our series on answer writing for general studies papers of civil service main examination. We take up a question that you might come across in GS paper 1. Here goes the question. Even if belatedly, almost every section of Indian society was to realize that British rule was against their economic interests. This was perhaps the breaking point in Indians' contacts with the British rule. Elucidate. If you were to put this question under the microscope, as the idiom goes, you would realize that the key to this question is this phrase actually, belatedly. This word, belatedly, is the key to this question actually. What it conveys, you could say the adverb belatedly conveys that some of the sections in India, some of the classes in India were late to realize the essentially exploitative nature of British rule. And when they did indeed realize it, that was the point when they sought to break away from the British rule, where they sought to throw away the British rule. And the keyword here is elucidate. That is, you have to give examples in support of the, you could say, the argument that you are making here, that in the exploitative nature, the economically exploitative nature of the British rule became evident to Indians. Fortunately, we have a very, you could say, well-known observation by Lord William Bentinck, the Governor General of India, you could say the contemporary Governor General of India, for our help. He observes that the bones of the Indian cotton weaver bleach the plains of India. This entire observation, it sounds so diabolical, and unfortunately it is also poignant in the sense that it should lead to some form of, you could say, sad feeling in you, that the ruin suffered by the Indian cotton weaver, and by that analogy by the Indian craftsman, for example the Indian cloth weaver, was so bad that he was dying of hunger, and his you could say his bones were spread across the great plains of India. This poignant observation is emblematic of the ruinous impact British colonial rule had on Indian artisan. Sadly, the situation was not any different for other sections of Indian society, each of which was to fare ill, that is, they were to do worse under the yoke of colonialism. It is widely accepted that the sole objective of modern colonialism is the economic exploitation of the colony for the benefit of the ruler, actually, the ruling party actually. What it essentially means that most of the historians, most of the scholars recognize that the modern colonialism is all about exploiting the colony, even at the, you could say, like mostly it is about benefiting the ruler even at the cost of the colony. And it was aimed at exploiting the resources and energy of the colony. We are using the word energy here in a you could say metaphorical sense. We are not talking about energy resources, but rather the human energy, for an example intellectual energy and the human resource of the colony. All of this was to enrich the colonial master, even at the cost of the rule, even at the cost of the colony itself. British rule was no exception. The first brunt of British rule was to fall on India's peasants and craftsmen. As you can understand very, very well, those days, these two, you could say, these two areas, agriculture and handicrafts, were the dominant sectors of Indian economy. But sooner or later, every section was to realize this. What are some of the classes, some of the sections which were to face the brunt of British colonial policy? First come the craftsmen. The craftsmen had to contend with unrestricted imports of the British factory-made good, which you can understand they could not compete with the cheaper factory-made goods, and ultimately they were driven to, you could say, close down. They were driven to ruins. The exchange rate policies, the currency exchange rate policies, which were so manipulated that they made the import cheaper, they made the import competitive, and the you could say the Indian manufacture uncompetitive. And moreover, there was restriction on market access in Britain itself. You can understand this. On the one hand, the British allowed unrestricted import into India. On the other hand, they restricted exports from India to Britain itself. So ultimately, the Indian craftsman was harmed in both, in two ways actually. First, he had to contend with, you could say, unrestricted imports. Second, he had lost the British market. Then come the peasants, who had to face extortionary land revenues which were mostly exploitative. Then he had to face the absentee landlord who disregarded farmers' interests. Actually, this is again argued by most scholars that the earlier feudal system, the earlier feudal lords, for example, during the Mughal rule, had some form of connection, they had some form of kinship or some fraternal relation with the peasant themselves. And so this meant that they had some form of sympathy for the peasant, or for that matter, they invested in the local agricultural infrastructure, etc. And ultimately, these things would have benefited the farmer and, in fact, the entire agricultural ecosystem. That was not the case with the new zamindar, who was mostly a revenue farmer. He had got this land on a form of lease, and he had no fraternal ties. He had no connection with the local farmer. He had no sympathy for the local peasant. Then come the middle class. The middle class realized that it was the drain of wealth that was ruinous to Indian economy. It would, as you can understand, it would mean the loss of purchasing power for India, and ultimately the aggregate demand would go down, which is, as you certainly know, which is harmful for the GDP. They also criticized the expensive administration. You can understand very, very well, the British sought to populate Indian administration with European bureaucrats. The higher echelons of Indian administration were always populated, they were always headed by the British or European bureaucrats. And the British or European bureaucrats had to be paid more than their Indian counterparts. And this would ultimately mean that Indian administration itself was becoming expensive and ultimately a burden on Indian exchequer. Then even the workers faced the British colonial exploitation. First, they were exploited in plantation sector. Actually, why we are mentioning plantation sector specifically, because the British sought to reserve the plantation sector for European capital, and in this sector, in plantation sector, the workers were not afforded any protection. Not only this, they were to contend with violation of their rights. For an example, rights of organization, that is forming union, or industrial action, etc. For an example, peaceful strikes, lockdowns, etc. Work down, tool down strikes, etc. So all of their rights, their even basic democratic rights were violated. At the same time, they were exploited by the British supported plantation capitalists, for example, plantation owners. And the irony is, it was not even the Indian industrialists who escaped the colonial exploitation. First, there was no level playing field with the European capitalists, and the European capitalists, the European industrial, you could say, in the European businessman was sought to be benefited at the cost of the Indian industrialist. Then there was some form of preferential treatments for the Europeans at the cost of Indian industrialists. We would again explain these points through a specific example later in the write-up. Now, explaining these points, as Governor General, Bentinck had drawn attention to the calamity that had fallen upon Indian craftsmen. We refer to the Indian craftsman here, not Lord William Bentinck. He was swamped by the cheaper factory-made cloth from Lancashire, which is a center for cloth manufacturing in Britain. The colonial administration refused him any trade protection. To add insult to injury, the currency exchange rate was manipulated to make Indian manufacture uncompetitive, and Indian product was deliberately discouraged in Britain to the extent of fining aristocrats wearing Indian originated luxury. Actually, there is an apocryphal story that is mentioned probably even by Professor Bipin Chandra, that once there was a case that a British noblewoman, actually someone from in British aristocracy, was found to be wearing an brooch, that is a piece of ornament that had originated in India, and the London mayor fined this lady just for wearing the brooch that was imported from India. That was the extent of British, you could say, restriction on import from India. Now coming to the peasants. The peasant was ruined by an extortionary land revenue policy. The cruel but paternal feudalism. We are making this point that the earlier feudalism, the cruel but paternal feudalism, which still cared for example, reinvestment, was replaced by the apathetic absentee zamindar. The zamindar who was actually living in the local city rather than in the village itself. That is why he is called the absentee zamindar, who had no fraternal feeling or kinship ties with the peasant. The new overlord rarely undertook to invest in improving farm infrastructure, or he rarely provided succor during a crop failure, and which would turn into a famine. Actually, whenever there is a crop failure, if for example the peasant is denied relief in the case of a crop failure, there is a chance that this crop failure would ultimately turn into a, you could say, a devastating famine. Now, even the emergent middle class it was initially enthusiastic about British rule, eventually modernizing India. Actually, the middle class had this false hope, actually, that the British would ultimately modernize India and take it out of the superstitious way of thinking of Indians. But again, this, you could say, this hope was dashed. But soon it was evident that policies like home charges, pensions to British officials, which were, you can understand, paid back home in Britain, and populating the administration with higher paid Europeans, were leading to drain of wealth from India, a concept that has been explicated by Dadabhai Nauroji, R.C. Dutt, and Mahadev Govind Ranade, Justice M.G. Ranade, etc. This would have led to loss of purchasing power and vitality of the economy. We are essentially hinting at the decrease in aggregate demand, while Indians got nothing in return. Obviously, when the British were spending back home their pensions, or for example home charges. Home charges means the charge the British exploited from India, the British extracted for India for ruling over them. So again, you can understand this irony that the Indians were forced to pay for their own enslavement by the British. This is called home charges. And all of these things were being spent in Britain, and ultimately these things would not have benefited Indian economy. Now, even the emerging class of industrial workers had first-hand experience of working of colonialism. They were denied protection against exploitation in sectors like plantation, which were dominated by European capital, which we would see later that this was one of the sectors which the British sought to monopolize. Apart from this economic extortion, their rights to organize or undertake industrial action like a strike, or you could say tool down, etc., were curtailed severely. Moreover, this is again ironical fact that not only the industrial worker but even the industrialists themselves were to face the brunt of British colonial exploitation. Even the incipient industrialist class too was aggrieved by British policies. Not only there was no level playing field against British capitalists, British sought to actively discourage Indian capital in sectors like plantation, steam navigation, etc. We have these two specific examples. First is the example of Mani Ram Diwan. Mani Ram Diwan was one of the, you could say, the first Indians who sought to enter the tea plantation sector. And he faced so much hurdles, he faced so many obstacles placed by the British administration that he was ultimately forced to rebel against the British during the 1857 rebellion. And Mani Ram Diwan from modern day Assam, he was a martyr actually. He was executed for his participation in the 1857 rebellion. So similar was the case of V.O. Chidambaram Pillai or V.O.C. Pillai, who was you could say an initiated by Indians in the steam navigation sector, that is the, you could say, shipping sector. And ultimately he too had to face so much obstacles that his company was forced to close down, and Mr. Pillai was jailed by the British on, you could say, on diverse pretexts actually. So these two examples actually they bear out what obstacles the Indian industrialists had to face at the hands of the British colonial administration. As with the craftsmen, the British manipulated, we are again repeating these points, that the British manipulated exchange rate to render Indian manufacture uncompetitive. No trade protection was provided against dumping of cheaper imports, as was the case for the Indian craftsmen. Such was the case for the Indian, you could say, industrialists too. And all these colonial policies ultimately ruined him too. And the nub of the argument is that ultimately it was the realization of the essentially economically exploitative nature of the British colonial rule that was to a prime driver of Indian opposition to British rule. This point mobilized a national opposition cutting across the class divide. Actually, if we were to become more specific, actually by the time of the, you could say, in the almost like the 30s and 40s, almost every section of Indian society except for the zamindars and moneylenders, whose interests were directly, you could say, in sync with the British colonial rule, almost every other sector had recognized that the British rule was ultimately ruinous. It was ultimately harmful for India's interest. And this is why they all of them sought to mobilize against the British rule. This is all for today. We hope to meet again with a new lecture in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.